So talk a little bit. I know this year education policy is a major focus of MCPP. So talk a little bit about what y'all are supportive of and what you've seen so far that you're happy to see get introduced.
There are three really exciting bills in particular. One is on, and they're all incidentally introduced in the name of the chairman of the Education Committee, Rob Robson. They're all his work and Jason White's work. The first is something called the Inspire Bill, and this is an attempt to reform a really arcane system of school funding we've got in Mississippi. At the moment, we've got a sort of almost Soviet-type system where we fund the system rather than the students. And he's come up with this really interesting and bold proposal so that we can actually fund individual students based on their individual need. So it would be a personalised system. So every child would get amount depending on a number of weighted factors. Tennessee did it a couple of years ago. It's working really, really well there. It's really exciting to see Rob Robson come up with this proposal here. There's also a bill on HB 1449 for Arkansas-type school choice. We see Sarah Huckabee Sanders on the other side of the river has introduced this wonderful new scheme that gives every single child in Arkansas the right to have a personalised account into which the state puts public money worth about $8,000 to $9,000 a year, and they can then redeem that, spend that at a school of their choice, public, private, or whatever. There's a proposal to do that. It's the so-called Magnolia Scholarship Fund. And there's also another bill, HB 1452, which is a more limited version of school choice, but I don't think we should overlook that. Plus, there are some other bills that are significant, increasing the number of bodies that authorise charter schools. We've got a real roadblock to reform in the inappropriately named Charter Authoriser Board, which has proved to be the Charter Non-Authoriser Board. So I think there's real movement. It's almost as if we're seeing the kaleidoscope shifting, and the sense of what is possible has changed dramatically, and it's really, really exciting.
Well, it's great, and you and I were talking about this off the air. The Republicans, who should be the conservative party in the state, have supermajorities in both chambers. Now's the time not to do incremental things where we bite around the edges. We need to do something massive.
We need to do things, and we need to do things that are bold and significant reform.
That's right.
Look at the states all around us. We're surrounded by 4 states. All 4 of those states are now moving towards the personalisation of education for each child, school choice. There are things we could do to become part of the Southern success story. We really mustn't be left behind. Arkansas is doing some incredible things, and I think we could do those things here. It takes a little bit of boldness, a bit of courage, but it's great to see these bills. It shows we're beginning to move in the right direction.
Let's talk about the school choice piece for a second, because you hit on something I think is important, because we get feedback, and if you want to be part of the conversation with Mr. Carswell, you can text us at 601-879-4395 on the C Spire text line. But we always get this feedback that people say, oh gosh, well now the legislators think that they're experts on education, but this isn't something we're just coming up with out of whole cloth. The people around us are already doing it and seeing success from these sorts of proposals.
Actually,
right?
I would say it's precisely because we know that politicians aren't the experts on education that we should give mum and dad more choice and control. I would hate to allow politicians to choose my weekly groceries. I'd probably end up starving. So why do we allow politicians to run a system of education that isn't giving us the best outcomes? It's about giving ordinary people control over their lives, not putting politicians in charge. But we know that the system of personalized learning works. We can see it in not just Arkansas, we can see it in Arizona, we can see it in half a dozen different states now across America. The results have been truly remarkable.
And and I think what's going on in Arkansas is a good example. I mean, Governor Huckabee has proposed massive changes there. I mean, it's not a little incremental thing. I mean, she's talked about universal school choice, and that's what they've passed, correct?
Absolutely. And it's not just that. I mean, she's doing a whole bunch of things that is really making Arkansas a standout success. I recently saw a little clip of hers on social media where she was talking about her achievements in her first year in office. And I mean, she's doing some phenomenal things, so much so that there are now a record number of people leaving California and moving to Arkansas.
That's something.
It's wonderful.
That would not have been a place I would have thought as a destination when I was a kid. That says something.
It is truly remarkable, and we could do that here if we. I'm not suggesting we should aim to have large numbers of Californians come here, but I do, on a serious note, think that if we were to change the education system the way Arkansas has done, the way Alabama is looking to do, the way Tennessee is committed to doing, the way even Louisiana is now committed to doing. If we do that, we will transform the education system for the better in this state.
Well, I hope we'll see that happen. Have y'all played a role in putting together that legislation, or more just providing facts for the legislature to consider as they put it together?
I think this is very much Rob Robson and Jason White's thing. I think they're the driving force and the brains behind this. Certainly, we will help, but I think this is actually change that is coming from the people whose names are on the bill.
On the school funding piece, I mean, that's obviously been Mississippi law, I think, since 1997, and I believe it's been funded twice, maybe in 99 and then again in 2007, both not coincidentally election years. Talk a little bit, if you can, about the problems with the current MAEP formula and what a better funding structure would be.
MAEP stands for Mississippi Adequate Education Funding Policy, and actually it's inappropriately named. It's a deeply inadequate system of funding. Why is it inadequate? It's inadequate, firstly, because it's hideously complex. There are only half a dozen people in Mississippi who truly understand it, and none of us can understand them when they explain it. It's also open to the charge that it's perennially underfunded, simply because by its very bureaucratic nature, it denominates an amount that ought to be spent. Any politician who fails to then meet that is then accused of underfunding it, despite the fact that under Republicans we've been putting record amounts into education. So it's inadequate in that sense. It's also fundamentally inadequate because it's really bad at putting money into the classroom. You look at the amounts of taxpayer money that have been put into public education through the MAEP, and they're just not getting into the classroom. Teacher pay is far lower than I think it should be. And I think this is because we're funding a Soviet-style system rather than funding students. The alternative that Rob Robson's come up with is for individualized amounts for every student, and it's weighted. So you can, and it's right that the legislature has a debate about this. Should you give people more for special needs or for living in a low-income neighborhood, or because they're particularly gifted, and if so, how much should that weighting be? And that's a conversation I think the legislature needs to have, and different politicians will have different views on that. But the point is that you end up with a personalized system. Back in 1997, we had clunky cell phones. Today, we have smartphones where we can choose the apps on them. The system of funding we have in Mississippi right now it's an analog system for a digital age, and we need a digital system for today.
That is a great way to put it, and it's amazing to me that there's really no other area you can think of where the government tells you where you have to go. I mean, you're free to go to the gas station you want, the grocery store you want, whatever, any other consumer product, that's your choice.
Of course. I mean, think about the absurdity if you could only shop in a grocery store if you lived in a particular zip code.
Right.
But I think it's also worth pointing out, and it's a really important point to get across, there will be some people who quite rightly are concerned that if you give people these freedoms, perhaps you would get people moving into certain districts. And I think you've got to say that actually it is possible for a school district that is full to actually say, I'm sorry, we're full and we can't take people from outside the district. And I think that's right and proper. You wouldn't foist people onto a private school without them being able to say we're full, and neither should you do that to school boards that are successful.
Right. It's really about keeping the home school district from trapping students when they want to leave.
And it's about getting good schools to students, not students to good schools.
FDIC. Well, Douglas Carswell, the president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, is here. As some of you may have noticed, I don't think that's a Corinth accent that you have, Douglas.
It's a Flowood accent.
Hey, we did have a listener that wants to know what his favorite tea is. And I said hot sweet tea in an English tea glass.
It's now sweet tea. I've become Southern. I drink sweet tea with everything.
When that was one of the questions. What was how do you take your tea, and what's your go-to tea, or do you even drink tea?
I now drink.
While we're playing to stereotypes,
I now drink far more sweet tea than English breakfast tea.
Okay.
I'm partial to the occasional cup of English breakfast tea, but I have sweet tea with pretty much everything now.
Okay. And what about a full English breakfast? Your thoughts on a fry?
No,
really?
No. I prefer waffles with fried chicken and syrup.
All right, one last.
His inner Belgian coming out.
All right, one last question with regards to English food and drink, and then we'll get back to the important work of making Mississippi the best place it can be. Blood sausage, pro or con?
I'd pass on that.
Really?
Yeah.
I love blood sausage.
Well, there are some things about the old country that I think need improving, and that's one of them.
We're talking about all the good work that the Mississippi Center for Public Policy is doing in the education space, and one thing that you mentioned that we didn't get a chance to really delve into was charter schools.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about what's been done since 2013 and what y'all are focused on or hoping that the legislature does?
Charter schools are wonderful. They're really, really important, or they could be if the authorizer board actually allowed more of them to exist. The charter authorizer board will tell you they've done a great job, but they've on average authorized one a year, and they've got an 80% rejection rate.
Really?
I think you have to ask some pretty tough questions as to why that might be. Now, the argument would probably be is the applicants aren't offering to create A-grade schools. Well, but that shouldn't be the choice. The alternative for many kids is to go to a good but not excellent charter school or go to what they've got at the moment. So I think the priorities of the Charter Authorizer Board have been way off and way out of line. The solution, I don't think, is to try to change the Authorizer Board. I think it's actually to create choice and competition, create alternative bodies such as universities that can authorize charter schools. And they do this in other states. If you're not good at your job, you should have the opportunity to go to someone else. So the Charter Authorizer Board needs competition, and I'm really pleased to see a number of bills proposing to do this in the legislature, and I hope some of them succeed.
And these would be letting other people, just different entities, be able to authorize other than just the authorizer board.
I think the real biggie in this are the universities. If universities get into the business of supporting and nurturing charter schools, that is a game changer. Yeah,
well, it's certainly an entities you would think would be familiar with how to educate people.
Yeah.
I know. What are some of your other focuses this legislative session? I know we've talked a little bit about y'all's work in the health space.
Yeah, I mean, healthcare. Mississippi just doesn't have a good system of healthcare if you measure it by health outcomes. And I think one of the reasons for this is because we've had laws for 30 years that have intentionally been anti-competitive. They've intentionally limited the number of healthcare providers. You have to ask some questions as to whose vested interests that might serve.
Right.
But why not get rid of those rules known as the Certificate of Need laws, the CON laws, appropriately named? Get rid of the CON laws and allow people to open new outpatient facilities or new diagnostic facilities without a permit. This isn't the Soviet Union. You shouldn't have to have a permit from a bureurocrat to provide something.
For listeners who aren't as familiar with the Certificate of Need law, how does it work currently under Mississippi law, the Certificate of Need law?
In 19 different areas of healthcare. If a current provider or someone wants to come along and expand provision, new provision, or even actually invest in a piece of equipment worth more than $1.5 million, which sounds a lot, but actually in healthcare is not a lot.
Sure.
If you want to do any of those things, you have to go to a group of bureaucrats and ask for their permission. And sitting on that board will be your direct would-be competitors if you were given permission. So unsurprisingly, you don't tend to get a lot of permits given for new entrants into the market. It's an entirely rigged cartel. We think this needs to change, and we think it's not just fair. We think actually if you changed it and allowed choice and competition, you would see lower healthcare costs. You would start to see all sorts of things done, lower diagnostic services. Suddenly healthcare would become much more affordable in a way that it just isn't for many
because
people.
of that the downward price pressure.
Yeah.
How does Mississippi compare to other states with regard to Certificate of Need laws?
There are about 100 million Americans who live in states with no Certificate of Need laws at all.
Okay.
And they are almost all better off in terms of health outcomes than we are. There are a number of states that do, about 20-something states have some form of Certificate of Need law, but often they're very, very limited. Mississippi is one of the worst for having it covering so many different areas, 19 different areas of healthcare. I'll give you one absurd example. Politicians will tell you they're worried about mental health services. Well, okay, so why do we have Certificate of Need restrictions on psychiatric services? We know that the demographics of the state have changed, with more baby boomers reaching a certain age where they might need to go into a nursing home or some sort of long-term health care. Why do we have Certificate of Need restrictions on the number of long-term beds? It's things like that just aren't working for the state. If we can get rid of these intentionally restrictive laws, the sky's not going to fall in. The existing hospitals are not going to fold as a result, but ordinary Mississippians might actually get better health care.
I assume that the current healthcare providers, the people who have certificates of need in those 19 areas, are not supportive of this reform.
Of course. Like taxi drivers when Uber comes along, they don't want the competition. If you have a permit that says only you can provide diagnostic services or home health services or whatever it is, you don't want someone else to come along without a permit and start to provide those services. But, I think we can all understand that if you said Uber couldn't operate in a city because you had to use existing taxis, it wouldn't be great for people who need to get around.
Right.
Why do we allow the vested interests who have the permits to keep out the competition that would serve all of us?
What sort of reaction have you all gotten from legislators as you all have talked about this?
What's been absolutely fascinating, we've been pushing for this for a decade and got absolutely nowhere. But what is absolutely extraordinary is with the new speaker and the new people in charge of the different committees, suddenly there are half a dozen different bills out there. And there's a real sense that actually we could address this. I think there's also a realization that if you don't do these things, the only thing left on the table is federal dollars through Medicaid expansion.
Right.
So you have to, if you don't want to expand Medicaid, you have to get serious about freeing up the health economy.
That's a great transition, Douglas. There's clearly a major push this year to consider some form of Medicaid expansion. I know. The speaker has said he's open to it. The lieutenant governor, I think, has explicitly said he believes that providing insurance to low-income working Mississippians would help with our workforce participation problem. Do you all have thoughts or a position on expanding Medicaid eligibility?
There really is a problem in Mississippi where a lot of people in Mississippi aren't getting health coverage, and I don't think we can ignore that. I just don't think that hosing federal dollars is a magic solution. Just look at the experience of states that similar to us, such as Louisiana, Arkansas, who have expanded Medicaid. In Mississippi today, roughly 1 in 4 people already receive some form of Medicaid benefit. Medicaid has actually expanded quite a lot. And I would suggest that the people on Medicaid have worse health outcomes than those on private insurance. Now, for me, the key question in all of this, let's not be ideological about it. Let's be pragmatic. If we want to help people who don't get health care, are we going to improve their outcomes by creating an incentive for them to leave some kind of private insurance and migrate towards a federally funded system? Now, people will say, there'll be a 12-month delay. Well, I'm not sure I think those are clear assurances. I think once you create a system of expanded Medicaid, you will inevitably see people migrating onto it who currently are able to fund their own provision. So, I'm not opposing this for ideological reasons. I think there are good practical reasons. Those who want to expand Medicaid have to show how it would improve healthcare, and I'm just not convinced. Incidentally, I don't really think that the people in favor of Medicaid expansion have the numbers. They talk as if they do, but we saw recently Tate Reeves show real leadership in coming out against Medicaid expansion. That means that the people in the two chambers don't just have to win it; they've got to win it by 2/3.
It would have to override a veto.
I'm skeptical that we're going to see Medicaid expansion, but we'll see.
Is there a solution? I mean, I think the counter argument that I've heard from a number of people is, when you're talking about, it's one thing if you're talking about a pure welfare benefit, but if you're talking about somebody who's working at McDonald's but not, doesn't have insurance coverage, I mean, is there a solution, or is it just government doesn't have a role in solving that problem?
Well, let's not be ideological about this. Let's be pragmatic about it. If the proponents in favor of Medicaid can come up with a model that would help that person working at McDonald's, and currently it's frankly unacceptable that there are people like that who don't have any coverage at all. If they can show that you can provide some system of coverage for people without it, and it wouldn't become a substitute for people who are currently on private insurance, then I think that would significantly change things. But I think the onus is on them to show that it wouldn't have that unintended consequence, and I don't think they have. And the experience of Louisiana, I think, reinforces the idea that throwing federal dollars through Medicaid is going to improve health outcomes. Louisiana just shows that isn't the case.
Happened. Well, we've got about 10 seconds left, Douglas. Any final thoughts before we head out?
I love being in Mississippi.
Well, thank you for being here, and thanks for all the good work that y'all do. This has been Douglas Carswell, the president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. This is Lucian Smith in for Paul Gallo here on the Gallo Radio Show on Super Talk.